speak a bit about the Kabbalah, but tonight I want to talk about the Kabbalah and Theosophy. They're both very deep, very serious subjects, and lots of people spend their lifetime poring over books, studying them, thinking about them, analysing them. And yes, you can do that, but you can also treat it in a much more light-hearted way. We don't have to be quite so serious about it. I sometimes think that the whole process of spiritual development is taken a bit too seriously. We still need to have a little bit of a light-hearted approach, a bit of fun about it. Life isn't supposed to be misery all the time, or study. But they are deep subjects, so excuse me if I do treat it in what appears to be at times a light-hearted way, but I'm not at all light-hearted about it, I can assure you. It all goes back basically to this idea of creation. What happened? What formed the universe? How did we become who we are today? Why are we here? All these basic questions. And what made me start thinking about this again recently was a television series called The Planets, which showed us all the planets in great detail. Very interesting, wonderful visual effects. What they can do with computers these days is absolutely amazing, but it was fascinating. But it led you eventually to the idea of creation. And they got to this point of the Big Bang. Well, we know that scientists for a long time have been talking about this idea of the Big Bang, but with this series they progressed it a bit further. They said that after the Big Bang, this great cloud of dust and atoms of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen accumulated together and formed clouds of gas, which eventually, through the force of gravity, were pulled together and formed planets. That's fine, I can go along with that, yes. But it left two basic questions in my mind. First of all, what caused the Big Bang? And secondly, where did the dust come from? And none of the scientists seem to be able to answer this question. So here we are, we've suddenly got nothing. And all of a sudden we have a Big Bang, and there's millions upon millions of tons of dust available to create all the stars and planets in the universe. Not just our galaxy, but the entire universe. Well, that to me suggests a tremendous amount of dust. And I have this sort of image of God up there with hundreds and hundreds of great trucks wheeling these great tons of dust over through the opening that the Big Bang has created to form his universe. Why can't science tell us what happened before the Big Bang? This is what I want to know. But I think we do know, because the Kabbalists knew and the Theosophists knew. It's just, unfortunately, scientists don't seem to have got to that stage yet. We know what happened, that there wasn't a moment of creation. The creation is an ongoing process that had no beginning and no end. In theosophical terms, we have a period of Mantana, where the earth and the universe is in manifestation, and then we have a period of pralaya when it goes back into a sleep state again. This had no beginning and it will have no end. So the creation, as is described by science, is just one incident in a whole chain of events that goes on over thousands of millions of years. Eternity, in fact, as Blavatsky described it. So, yes, we get a Big Bang when the earth, the universe, the cosmos wakes up again. Yes, it's a Big Bang. It's like us waking up from our sleep. And the dust is there because it's the remnants of the previous round, the previous cycle. We know that. But the Kabbalists knew this and the Theosophists knew this. So we see straight away we have something very, very much in common with these two different, or apparently different, spiritual approaches. In fact, they're both saying the same thing. In fact, the early Kabbalists back in the 11th and 12th century actually wrote in some of their works that creation is an ongoing process, long, long before Theosophy appeared on the scene. So we see that it's not a new idea, but it does surprise me that scientists haven't yet cottoned on to this, but maybe we give them a few hundred years, they might catch up with us, who knows. So that's my starting point, this similarity between Kabbalistic thought and Theosophical thought. But there are differences outwardly, but not inwardly. You could say that in one sense, the Kabbalah is the yoga of the West. We know that through our theosophical traditions we're brought up with the idea of yoga and the Eastern teachings that were brought through by Madame Blavatsky and the Masters. But through the West there was also a Kabbalistic form of yoga which in some senses equals or mirrors the Eastern system. In the East we've got basically 5 schools of yoga. We have Raj Yoga, the education of consciousness through meditation and contemplation. We have Bhakti-Yoga, the religious way of devotional mysticism. We have Jnana Yoga, the pursuit of enlightenment through theosophical speculation. We have Karma Yoga, the application of yoga through right living, and Hatha Yoga, the control of the body and the development of inner physical resources. These are the ways that the East has developed them. But we do have systems in the West that, I say, equal these, but perhaps in a slightly different way. If we look at the Western system, for example, we have Raj Yoga. Now, in studying the Kabbalistic tree of life, meditation is a very, very important thing. They do have schools which teach a meditation technique very, very similar to Raj Yoga. I was a member myself for many years of a school called the Servants of Light, which taught very, very strict meditation techniques, very, very similar to those taught by the Eastern schools of Raj Yoga. So we see straight away there is a similarity there. If we look at Bhakti Yoga, the devotional way, we can see that mirrored in the West very, very easily. We see it particularly through our more high churches, Catholic and Anglican, where a tremendous amount of energy is poured into devotion. But again, through Kabbalistic methods, there are, in the form of ceremonial, magic, ritual, chants, prayers, incense, this type of thing, the devotional aspect plays a major part. And there are certain Kabbalistic organisations that place great emphasis on the devotional side. Then we have Jnana Yoga, this way of knowledge, of speculation, of theosophical and philosophical speculation. The tree of life is an excellent way to develop that. In some ways I would say equals the theosophical studies of things like the Mahatma letters or the secret doctrine, because it can open the mind to lateral thinking, which is very, very important. It's sometimes so easy when one is following a spiritual path to become rather blinkered. You see your way ahead, but you don't realise that maybe the people either side of you have a different way, a different approach. You're all heading towards the same goal, but you have a different approach, but we become blinkered. And I think that through Jnana Yoga, by meditation and speculation upon the tree of life, we can see that there are many, many ways of reaching the same goal. It helps to expand us as human beings. And then Karma Yoga. To the students of the Kabbalah, what he learns through his studies has to be applied to his physical life. We cannot divorce spiritual development from our physical life. We don't want to be Sunday afternoon Theosophists or Sunday afternoon Christians. This does not work. In the same way, we cannot be Thursday afternoon Kabbalists either. You are either a Kabbalist or a Theosophist or not. You can't pick and choose. It has to be demonstrated very, very strongly through our personal life. The only way that we are going to influence, if that's the right word, people and our surroundings is by our own activities, by the way that we present ourselves to the world, the way that we act towards other people, through our kindness, through our generosity, through our sympathy. And this comes very strongly through the Kabbalah. He lives his life within those spiritual principles. And it's so easy these days with the distraction of television, of sport, of life generally, to be pulled away from those spiritual principles so that we just come back to them occasionally. It's not good enough, I'm afraid. This is usually expressed in the Western form through the myths and legends of King Arthur and his knights in the search for the Holy Grail. This devotion in searching for a spiritual truth, I think, is the way that I would describe it. And then Hatha Yoga, this sensitivity that is brought about can be brought about for temporary periods of time through a Western method, again of ritual magic, rather like the Bhakti method. I say for a temporary measure because one of the weaknesses that one finds with prolonged Hatha Yoga perhaps is that one becomes almost oversensitive to the physical world that we're living in. And we do live in difficult times. Civilization is speeding up so rapidly that the more sensitive we become, the more difficult it is for us actually to function successfully in the material world. And we have to remember that this is where we are, whether we like it or not. We're in the material world, so we can't afford to be oversensitive. So many people who start to develop in a spiritual sense start to think they are rather precious. Oh, I'm so sensitive, I can't face this, I can't deal with it. Oh, it's all too much for me, I'm such a sensitive little flower. That's fine for a short period, but we have to be able to balance that sensitivity with practicality. I say we're here in the physical world. So through the study of the Kabbalistic techniques of ceremonial magic, one can reach that height of sensitivity, but for a temporary period, so that one can earth oneself down again and come back into the physical world and function normally. So there are the similarities with the Eastern method of yoga and the Western method of Kabbalistic study. But let's have a look at what some of the early Theosophists had to say about the Kabbalah. First of all, Madame Blavatsky mentioned it quite a deal in the Secret Doctrine. I've got some diagrams here later which I will pass round, showing some of the correspondences she shows between what I would say was orthodox theosophical teachings and the Kabbalistic method. So she was obviously very, very much aware of it. In fact, one or two of the early theosophical teachers did refer to this point. First of all, we have William Judge. In his book, or collection of writings rather, The Ocean of Theosophy, he wrote quite dogmatically that the early Hebrew prophets, Abraham, Moses and Solomon, were amongst the masters, such as Kuthumi and Morier. Now, this is a very disputable point amongst theosophical circles as to who the masters are. And we had a bit of, excuse me, had a slight discussion of this while we were having tea this afternoon as to who are the masters and who are in touch with them. But Judge seemed to put these early Hebrew prophets amongst them. So that was obviously a feeling on his part that there was a connection between, excuse me, I've got a cough coming on, Theosophy and the early Kabbalistic teachers, because people like Moses and that were at the beginning of Kabbalistic teachings. But there is a much stronger connection between Theosophy and the Kabbalah than we would imagine. And it shows up here in a pamphlet called The Golden Dawn and the Esoteric Section. It was written by the Theosophical History Centre back in 1987. Makes me realise how old I am. I was around when it was published. It's a very interesting thing. It does show a cross-fertilisation between members of the Golden Dawn, particularly those based in Bradford, and the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society. For quite a period of maybe 4 or 5 years, a large number of members were members of both. So we see there that we have this strong theosophical teaching coming through the esoteric section, but we also have the Kabbalistic teaching coming in at exactly the same time through membership of the Golden Dawn. Very interesting period indeed. I say it didn't last for more than 3 or 4 years, but there was obviously a tremendous amount of sort of what I would say cross-fertilisation going on. And I'll come back to that later in the talk because it can be shown very clearly through the works of Arthur Waite. Give me a moment. Thank you. No, that's lovely, thanks. The other theosophical teacher, or writer rather, of that early period was a Jewish theosophist called A.L. Boltzmann. Not very heard of much these days. I think he only wrote 1 or 2 books, and I've only ever seen one of them. He wrote in 1916 a little book called The Mistress of the Kabbalah, in which he states that the 2 books of stanzas were actually based on ancient Hebrew texts. Now, I don't know how Madame Blavatsky would have accepted that. I mean, this was written, 16, 18, 20 years after her death. She wouldn't have been too happy, I don't think, about this statement. But he wrote this book, and obviously he could see the parallels between the stanzas an ancient Hebrew text, which I think is very interesting. Whether Madame Blavatsky actually got it from that source or not, or whether the masters got it from that source, in some senses is completely irrelevant. The fact is that there is a strong similarity that a Jewish theosophist picked up between those two works, which I think is absolutely fascinating. But his book sort of disappeared out of print, and I've never seen one since. I think it was probably only ever printed once. So, going back to how we started with this idea of creation, which is the one that fascinates me at the moment, to such an extent I think that Jane gets tired of hearing about the dust, but it does intrigue me. First of all, let's have a look at what Kabbalistic thought had to say about creation. First of all, you've got the Orthodox Judaism approach, that God is there sitting on his throne and he created the universe. Bang, that's it. No discussion, no queries, no questions, that is it, right? It all happened in 7 days, whether you like it or not. Bang, that's the end of it. That's one way of looking at it. The Kabbalists didn't actually look at it that way. They found it was rather different. And they looked, perhaps at the Bible. They thought, maybe the Bible isn't supposed to be interpreted literally. Perhaps it is symbolic. Perhaps it doesn't actually mean what it says in words. And they looked at it very carefully, particularly verses 2 to 5 in Genesis. They were very struck with this, because these are the ones that really deal with creation. And it says here, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water. And God said, Let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness night." Right, now that's a very interesting statement, isn't it? He's dividing light and darkness, separating them. It's in some senses the first act of creation, separating these two things. But let's look at it in more detail. Unless you're a fundamental Christian, it's obvious that here we're talking about different things. Water and light are not to be understood in the everyday terms. One could say that the dark night is what the Kabbalists would call Ein, the unknown, the nothingness, the absolute being, that which Madame Blavatsky would say was beyond all speculation. Right? That's the dark void. They would say that the Spirit of God was the Ein Sof. Sorry. I shall have another drink. The Ein Sof, which in Kabbalistic terms is the light, or the limitless light perhaps, but is the next form down. First of all you've got this nothingness, and then you've got the light, and then you've got the light itself, which is Ein Sof, or which is the first, not even thought, one could say it wasn't even thought, it's beyond thought. It's the first stirrings of a thought of bringing this world, this universe, into manifestation again. The Kabbalah, or the Kabbalists, would call it the 3 veils of negative existence. Madame Blavatsky would say it was that was beyond human contemplation and speculation. It's something that is really beyond our minds, but it is there. It's the eternal reality that never ever changes. And I think it's fascinating to think that both the Kabbalists and the Theosophists were aware that there was some over-guiding principle or intelligence that was eternal, but manifested itself occasionally in a physical form. And this is what we're talking about here, the negative veils of existence. Nothingness, the limitless light, and the light. They come together eventually in the top of the tree of life. Now, how many of you here are familiar with the diagram of the tree of life? I'm sure most of you must be, yeah. Well, I can pass them around if anybody wants to look at them. Pass them around, right? I'd like to share them out. if we look at the top of the tree, we have the first Sephiroth called Kepha. But the Kabbalists would say that beyond that, or above that, were these three negative veils of existence that are there eternally. And it's when that... It's hard to put into terms, isn't it? It's not a thought, it's what happens before thought even takes place, then a process of manifestation starts to create itself. It works from within in an interesting way. Have you ever seen a water sugar solution slowly evaporating, and you're left with the crystals of water on the side of a glass, of crystals of sugar rather, on the side of the glass as the water evaporates away, right? Well, if you imagine the Kepha is like that, it's a flowing mass in the void, like a gas almost, and that gas slowly starts to crystallize into a form. It's not a form that we would recognize as such, but it is a form, and that is Kepha, the first idea, the first inklings of manifestation. It's very, very early on, I say almost, again, in theosophical terms, beyond our speculation, but something is beginning to happen in the universe. And going back to my original statement, one would say that this was the Big Bang. This is when it started, at that point. Before that, there was nothing. Now, earlier this afternoon, we spoke about one of the Kabbalistic ideas of God contracting upon himself to create space. And this is another interesting idea that we can develop along these lines. Because if we believe or think that there is an absolute intelligence that is internal and that we are just periodic manifestations of it, then what is there when we are not there? Is space there, or does space disappear during a pralaya? This is the thing. The pralaya is this process of sleep between manifestations. Now, is the space still there, or does the space disappear during a pralaya? These are very profound questions, in fact, and very important ones. And one of the Kabbalists said that in order to create a universe, God had to contract into himself to provide the space for the universe to manifest itself in. And we need to look at this in theosophical terms as to whether that space contracts during a manvantara so that the universe can come into manifestation, or whether during pralaya the space is still there. It's a very, very interesting question, and I haven't really seen it dealt with in any theosophical literature yet, but I would like to pursue it, I must admit, because we have to know that fact as to whether there is anything there or not, or whether it just disappears back into this uncomprehendable void, and then suddenly at the force or the start of a Big Bang, the space creates itself. God literally contracts into himself, space is created, and within that space a new universe is created. These are very, very interesting speculations, and I must say that the Theosophists of the 10th, 11th and 12th century spent a lot of time contemplating this issue as to what happened prior to that moment of creation. Just the same as Madame Blavatsky spends a lot of time in The Secret Doctrine dealing with it. Wonderful phrases there in the first book, how she describes it. I mean, in her second proposition, for example, the eternity of the universe in toto is a boundless plain, periodically the playgrounds of numberless universes, increasingly manifesting and disappearing. I mean, exactly the same thing. They increase, they manifest, they disappear. An ongoing cycle of creation, of death, of creation, of death, or perhaps not death, of creation and sleep, perhaps would be a better way of describing it. And then again, in her first fundamental proposition, a very similar thing. She speaks of an omnipresent, boundless and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the powers of human conception and can only be dwarfed by any human expression. It is beyond the range and reach of thought. That is it, exactly again what the Kabbalists were saying, that you cannot speculate what was beyond Kepha, those three negative veils of existence. They knew they were there, but they couldn't really speculate on what they were, although they wrote numerous works trying to explain it. So that's one way of looking at it. But what we have to do then is see if we can relate this tree of life, as it was drawn out by the Kabbalists, to some of the works of Madame Blavatsky. Now these are drawn directly from the Secret Doctrine, and I'll pass these round again and you'll see. The first one deals with the relationship to the Kabbalistic tree of life and the various globes of existence that take place on the various planes. I'll pass these round, perhaps to have a look at those, and then I'll talk about them. I've had to keep one myself to have a look at, actually. One between two, Jane says, right? Now, as we all know from our theosophical teachings, the number of 7 is very, very important. We have 7 planes of existence, 7 globes, and 7 crops up over and over again. Each of the subplanes is divided into 7 planes below that. So 7 carries on all the way through. So Madame Blavatsky here is comparing the Kabbalistic tree of life, which has 10 spheres on it, with the theosophical system that only has 7. And if we look here, if we look at the first, second and third planes, these are the realms of negative experience or negative existence, if you like, the ones that are beyond speculation. So we can't see these. She actually calls them the 3 higher planes of the cosmos, the divine and formless world of spirit. So there again she's dealing with the first 3 theosophical planes of existence and the 3 negative veils of existence. But then if we look at the eastern side and compare it with the Chaldean side, as Madame Blavatsky said the Kabbalah originated in Chaldea, we see here that she's got some of the Sephiroth from the Tree of Life and the globes. Now the globes, as we know, are mirrors, images of the earth on different planes of existence, on the astral, on the mental, and the lowest one, the globe D, on the physical. So here we have the earth, globe D, on the 4th plane, physical material, and the bottom of the Kabbalistic tree of life, Malkuth. So we bring the two together down here into the physical world together. No discrepancy there at all. If we look up to the 2nd level, plane 3 as she calls it, we have 2 globes and we have one of the Seraphim, Yesod. And this is the astral plane, the astral world. So we have 2 of the theosophical globes in the astral plane and one of the Sephiroth on the tree of life on the astral plane. But we also see that 2 of them cross over between the astral and the mental, which is interesting. Hod and Netzach cross between the 2. So we've got partly astral, partly mental at that point. There's a crossover point there. But the globes are firmly placed into the intellectual mental field. The top 2 globes, Gevurah and Hesed, are placed in the archetypal world, which would be the higher mental in theosophical terms, and the 2 globes, A and G, are also placed in that. So she's saying here that there is a correspondence between these 2 systems on a physical, on an etheric, on an astral, on a mental level. Very detailed. One would have to read the Secret Doctrine to get the full meaning of all of this, but she shows it, I think, very clearly one way of looking at it. She shows it again in the 2nd set of drawings, which is the 7 planes. I won't pass it around, it's the basic thing. The theosophical principle is of these 7 planes of existence. The first plane being the first 3 planes being the unmanifested world, and the bottom planes being the manifest or material world. Now the Kabbalists also speak of 4 worlds. Not only do they look at the tree of life and say we have 10 Sephiroth on this tree, but we also have 4 different levels of existence on this tree as well. We have the archetypal world, we have the intellectual creative world, we have the formative world, and we have the physical world. Again, these fit in perfectly with the idea of theosophical teaching, of a physical world, of an astral world, of a lower mental, of a higher mental, and so on up the tree until one reaches Atma and Buddhi at the top. So we can see that there are very, very strong correspondences between these two. They've never really been put together, I don't think, in a very cohesive way. Some people have written about them, but they always tend to write about them, I think, with a certain bias. They either write about them from a purely Kabbalistic point of view, tending to ignore the theosophical correlationship between them, or they write them from a theosophical point of view, which tends to be heavily loaded towards the East and ignoring the Kabbalistic side. We haven't yet got any books that I've come across which show you in great detail what Madame Blavatsky was trying to say. And I feel what she was trying to say is we have two systems here. One grew up in the West through Judaism and the Kabbalah. One grew up in the East through the Upanishads and the Vedanta. But in fact, they are the same system saying the same thing. And if only people could see this, there would be no discrepancy between them. One would say, well, my system's right and yours is wrong. People would say, yes, this system is the same. It's just a slight difference of interpretation, nothing more than that. Now, all of this tended to come together really at the turn of the century. I suppose 1888 was the crucial year. Things move slowly in spiritual terms, I'm afraid. We talk in millenniums, not the odd years, I'm afraid. But in 1888, we did come to a very crucial turning point. We had the publication of the Secret Doctrine, and we had the formation of the Golden Dawn. I don't think this was any coincidence. I think that nothing is coincidence in actual fact, and that's a completely different lecture. What we've got here are two systems, one based in the East, one based in the West, coming into fruition at exactly the same time, in the same year. And as we saw from this pamphlet, The Golden Dawn and the Esoteric section, there was a cross-fertilization between the membership for a time. This really came to a head with Arthur Waite, I mentioned this afternoon. He's a fascinating man. He was a very ponderous. His writing is not easy. He was very fond of words and laboured a point rather, I'm afraid. But he did actually bring together the Kabbalah, Theosophy and Christianity together into one cohesive system. He's written numerous books. One of them is called the Holy Kabbalah, which is fascinating. It's a rather long work, but it is a very detailed history and explanation of the Kabbalah. He's also written numerous books touching on the theosophical side of it, but most of all, he produced a tarot pack, the Rider-Waite tarot pack. And I think that this is an attempt to bring the two systems together into one cohesive being, one whole system which draws on the East, the West and Christianity. If we'd had a slide projector this evening, I would have shown you one or two slides of tarot cards. But we've got the cards here somewhere, if I can find them. And I'd like you to have a quick look at one or two of them, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about here. It's quite amazing. Although the tarot had been around quite some considerable time, it wasn't until Waite brought out his pack in 1900 that he brought all the symbolism together. And I think this is the important thing, the bringing of the symbolism together. The earlier cards had it there, but basically from a Kabbalistic point of view. It was Waite himself who managed to bring all of these aspects together. The first one I like to pass around is called the Magician. If you all have a quick look at it, you'll see that if one looks at the symbolism carefully, it brings together theosophical and Kabbalistic teachings very, very clearly indeed. First of all, over the Magician's head, we have the sign of infinity, eternity, that which is beyond speculation, right? It's there, the absolute reality, the eternal omnipresence. It's all there in that infinity sign over the Magician's head, right? So he was very aware of that. Below that, we've got the Magician standing himself, but he has a white band across his forehead, separating the higher from the lower mental levels. Very interesting that he saw that. he saw that the higher mind was in touch with the infinity, that the lower mind was in touch with the physical world. So again, he brought in very, very clear theosophical teaching there, distinction. Only people that knew that would recognise that this is what he was talking about, dividing the mind into the two areas, the higher going up, the lower coming down into the physical world. But more than that, he's got his sword, he's pointing down his wand at the table. On the table he's got the four elements: fire, earth, air and water. Right, so he's saying here that he's drawing with one hand from up high, he's drawing down from the divine source and directing down into the physical world all that divine power and energy, giving him control over the physical world he lives in, drawing on a direct spiritual source. And I think it's a magnificent card, really. It's something that we should all be aiming to do, to be able to draw on that pure spiritual energy to transform not only our own lives, but the lives of people around us. He's saying here that every human being has the ability to transform not only themselves, but the world that they live in. But not many of us accept it. We say, no, I'm not the magician, I couldn't do that, it's beyond me. Let's leave it to the masters, let's leave it to the gurus to do it, let somebody do it for me. In fact, what Waite is saying so clearly with that card is that all of us can do it if we want to. But the point is, do we want to? It means effort, it means discipline, it means control. It's much easier to sit indoors and watch television than go out and do something positive in the world. I think it's a hard battle, but the fact that we're here tonight suggests that some people are actually prepared to do something. And I think what he's saying more than anything else is that the only person that we can start with is ourselves. We can't start with anybody else. It's very nice to be filled with evangelical zeal and rush out and want to change the world. I did it when I was in my 20s, very strongly, really keen to change the world overnight. But as I got older, I realised that I had to change myself. And by changing myself, I might, just might, have a slight effect on other people around me. And if I could bring a little change into them, maybe they could bring a little change into somebody else. We're not going to change it in this lifetime, or the next, or the next. And I think I read somewhere many years ago that Buddha waits on the threshold of nirvana until every grain of sand has been enlightened. If that's the case, we've got a long, long road ahead of us, a very long road. And I sometimes say to Buddha, please be patient, we're trying our best, we really are, but we're falling short, aren't we? We sometimes look around us and think that there aren't many of us here tonight, 15, 20 of us. Out there are millions of people who aren't the slightest bit interested in what we're talking about, but that doesn't matter. The fact that we are gathered together and are prepared to think and talk about it creates a thought form that, whether we like it or not, will eventually affect other people. And that's the important thing. By creating a positive spiritual thought form, which is exactly what the early Kabbalists were trying to do, it's certainly what the early Theosophists were trying to do, and let's remember they were really into thought form in a really big way, particularly Besant and Leadbetter. By creating that positive thought form, we can bring about changes. Now, it's very easy to get disheartened and say, no, nothing's happening, the world's in a mess. Look at it, we're coming up to the millennium and we're no better off than we were 100 years ago. We're no better off in some senses than we were 1,000 years ago in a spiritual sense. That is pure defeatism, and once we start that train of thought, then that spreads like a snowball throughout the world. It's so easy. I remember Douglas Baker saying to me once, at a lecture I listened to in York, he said to me that the whole world is covered in this great blanket of negative thought forms that are the result of the Boer War, the First World War, the Second World War, Vietnam, everything else has created a tremendous negative thought form that is completely enclosing the world. If we want the changes to take place, if we want to bring about heaven on earth, then we've got to disperse that thought form. And the only way we can disperse it is by positive thought within ourselves. We all get moments of depression, unhappiness and anxiety, and I know I do often enough. But I'm aware of it, and I know what's happening to me, and we've all got to be aware of it, and we've got to say, yes, okay, I'm only one person, but I can bring about changes. And this is really what all of these spiritual disciplines are about, are bringing about a change within ourselves so that we can project a positive thought form into the world, and maybe in the lifetime of your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren, you might actually start to see a change in human consciousness. It's not going to happen overnight, just like that. There have been so many prophets and teachers in the past that have said on a certain day a new spiritual energy will come in, the world will have its level of consciousness raised, everything will be beautiful and wonderful, nirvana will be here. It doesn't work like that, I'm afraid. It works within us. And until we've done it ourselves, nothing else is going to change. So let's remain positive. Let's keep on working. Let's bring Hatha and Karma Yoga into our lives, Karma Yoga particularly. Let's, by our rightful living, bring about the changes that we all hope and wish for. I'm positive. I know it can be done. I hope that you all feel the same. Thank you very much.